In the winter of 1887, in the high valley below the Wind River peaks, the cold killed nearly everything that drew breath. Cattle by the thousand. Men who walked out to the woodpile and were not found until the thaw, 30 steps from their own doors, the axe still in their hands. The people who lived through it never gave it a fancy name. They only ever called it the Stone Winter, because that was the year the ground turned to stone and stayed that way until April. And in the middle of all that dying, there was a woman the valley had thrown away. They had put her out of the only house she had. They had taken her good name, or near enough. They had called her a curse, and a fool, and worse. And when the last of them watched her walk up the canyon toward the falls, with one dog and one bundle on her back, they were all certain of the same thing. She was walking off to die. She did something that autumn that made the whole valley laugh out loud. She crawled in behind a frozen waterfall, into a crack in the mountain barely wide enough to fit her shoulders. And she made it her home. They said it was madness. They said no living soul could winter behind the water, in the dark, in the damp, with the cold coming on like a judgment. They had a word for her by the first hard frost, and they said it in the store and at the church door. The cave witch, that was what they called her. But when the Black Northern came down out of Canada, and the glass fell to 44 below, and the strongest cabins in that valley began to fail one after another, when the very people who had laughed started to freeze at their own hearths with the fires roaring, there was exactly one warm place left in all that country. It was behind the water. So, sit with this, before we go another step. What did she find inside that crack in the mountain that none of her neighbors knew was there? What had her father taught her, years before, in the dark of a played-out mine, that the cleverest builder in the valley swore was impossible? And when the people who threw her out came crawling up that frozen canyon in the dead of night, begging at the mouth of a cave they had mocked, what do you suppose a woman like that did? Stay with me, because by the time this is over, the word they spat at her like poison is going to mean something else entirely. If you believe the ones who get laughed at are sometimes the only ones still standing when winter is finished with everybody else, subscribe now and stay to the end. You will want to be there for the knock on the door. Her name was Marin Crane, before she was anything else, and the valley would not give that name back to her for a long, long time. She had come into that country as a bride in the spring of 1884, and for 2 years she was simply Tom Sutter's wife. Tom was a quiet man with big hands and a slow smile. His brother Silas ran the bigger place down the valley, with the bigger barn and the bigger voice. And Silas never had thought much of the woman his brother chose, a woman who would rather watch a fire than talk over it. Then came the winter of 1885, and the thing that broke her open. Tom went out in a storm to bring the horses in, and the storm closed over him like a lid, and he did not come back. They found him 2 days later against the drift fence, the cold having done its quiet work, and Marin, who was carrying their first child, took the news standing up and did not fall. She held until the baby came too early, 3 weeks after they buried the father. The child lived one night. One single night, in a cold cabin, with Marin's whole body wrapped around it. And then she was alone in a way that has no proper word. That was her wound, and she carried it under everything afterward. A husband taken by the cold. A child taken by the cold. She had paid for the lesson twice. She stayed on the Sutter place that next year because she had nowhere on this earth to go. She worked. She earned her keep 3 times over. But Silas had decided, somewhere in his hard heart, that a widow with no land and no child was a debt, and a debt should be settled and sent on. And when the second autumn came, with another winter sharpening itself on the peaks, Silas Sutter put her out. He did it on a grey morning with the whole household watching. He set her bundle on the step. He said the place could not feed an extra mouth through the cold. And that was the truth and the lie of it both, because the Sutter cellar was full. The cruelest part was how reasonable he made it sound, a man settling his accounts. The only one who cried was the little girl, Silas's youngest Tess, 7 years old, who had taken to following Marin around the dooryard like a duckling. Tess held to Marin's skirt and would not let go, and they had to peel her off, and that small wet face was the last thing Marin saw clearly as she walked out the gate. She did not argue. She did not curse them. She picked up her bundle, and she whistled once, low, and out from under the porch came the dog. Bram was a big rough brindle thing. a stray that had decided he belonged to Maren and to nobody else. He walked at her left knee with his ears working, and the two of them went up the road out of the valley, and the valley watched them go and felt, most of it, a clean sense of having done the necessary thing. Now, a woman thrown out with winter coming has a short list of ways to die, and the valley knew every one. So when a freighter came down 3 days later and reported that the Sutter widow had not gone over the pass at all, that she had turned up the dead-end canyon along Tulla Creek, the valley was puzzled, and then it was amused, because there was nothing up there. No cabin, no cave anyone had ever bothered with, no reason on God's earth to climb up there as the snow came on, unless, as Della Hockett said in the store, loud enough for the whole place to laugh, the widow meant to set up housekeeping with the trout. Unless she planned to winter behind the water like an otter, like a witch, and there it was. The word hung on her like a brand. The Cave Witch of Tulla Creek. It went around the valley in a single afternoon, and it stuck, because it gave people something to feel above. Silas heard it and did not correct it. He let the joke do the work of his conscience. Maren heard the name too. Eventually, she said nothing. She let them keep their word, and she kept her work, and a person who does not flinch is a hard person to wound twice. Because here is what the valley did not know. Maren Crane had not gone up that canyon blind, and she had not gone up there to die. She had gone because of her father. Her father was Eli Crane, and Eli Crane was a hard rock man, a driller, a powder man, a reader of stone. He had spent more of his life inside mountains than on top of them, and the first thing he taught her was this: the deep rock keeps one mind all year. He would put her bare hand flat against the wall of a drift in the worst heat of July, and the rock would be cool. Then he would bring her back in January, with the snow piled to the lintel outside and the air shrieking, and that same wall would be warm. Not warm like a stove, warm like a living thing. The cold hunts the open, he told her. It races over the snow and pours down the slopes and finds every wall a man builds and gnaws at it day and night. But it never thinks to look down into the rock. Cold hunts the open. A wise person goes to where the rock is breathing and lets the mountain do what it has been doing since before there were people to freeze. And there had been a place. When Maren was small, the family had camped one summer up a side canyon, and her father had shown her a thing he loved. A crack in a cliff behind a waterfall, where the creek came off a ledge, and behind the falling water the rock split back into a long, low room. And at the back of that room, a little spring welled up out of the floor, and the spring was warm. It steamed faintly, even in summer, and it had never once, her father said, never in the hardest winter the country ever threw, frozen over. A spring that never freezes, he told her, is the mountain showing you its warm blood. Mark a place like that, girl. Most people walk past it their whole lives and never know it for what it is. But a place like that will keep you alive when every wall in the world has failed. She had been, perhaps, 8 years old. She had forgotten it for 20 years. And then Silas Sutter set her bundle on the step, and something in the deep ground of her own memory turned over, and she remembered. The falls, the room behind the water, the spring that never froze. The deep rock keeps one mind all year. So she did not go over the pass to beg. She went up Tulla Creek to the one inheritance her father ever left her, which was knowing where to look. Now I will tell you about Isa Dunmore, because the story is not honest without him. Isa Dunmore was the best builder in that valley and the least foolish man in it, and when he heard where the widow had gone, he did not laugh. He was 61 years old. He had buried 2 men he loved to the winter, and he respected the cold the way a sailor respects the sea. When Della Hockett made her joke about the otter and the witch, Isa did not smile. He frowned. But understand this. Isa Dunmore thought Maren was going to die, and he had good reasons, and not one of them was foolish. He rode up the canyon himself once, in late October, because his conscience would not let a person freeze in his own country without a warning. He found her at the falls, working, and he told her, plainly, and without cruelty, every true thing he knew. A cave will kill you with damp, he said. The wet gets into your blankets and your bones and never leaves, and a damp cold is worse than a dry one. That was true, and Maren knew it. A cave will kill you with bad air. You cannot run a fire in a hole in the rock. The smoke has nowhere to go. It pools. It poisons you in your sleep, and you never wake to know it. He had seen it happen to a line camp once. 3 men gone with the fire still smoking. And the falls will betray you. When the real cold comes, that water freezes, builds out from the rock in tons of ice, and it seals you in or it comes down and crushes you. Either way, the mountain has you. He told her all of it. And then the thing underneath all of it. There is no shame in coming down, he said. Pride has killed more people in this valley than the cold ever did. Come down and winter with someone and let this go. And he meant it. And it was, in its way, the wisest thing anyone said to her that whole autumn. Only it was not pride that kept Maren Crane up that canyon. It was knowledge. And the two can look the same from the outside, right up until the storm tells them apart. She thanked him. She told him he was right about the damp, and right about the air, and right about the ice, and she meant it. And then she told him she was going to stay, and she did not explain why. Isa rode back down the canyon heavy-hearted, certain he had just spoken to a dead woman. What Maren did between that day and the killing of the winter was the work of her hands, and it is worth telling slow, because the work was the whole of it. She had the room behind the falls. The first thing was to learn it. She went in past the curtain of water, soaked through, Bram shaking off beside her, and she felt her way back into the dark, with her bare hand on the wall, reading the stone the way her father taught her. 20 feet in, where the daylight died, the rock went dry and faintly warm under her palm, and there at the lowest point of the floor was the spring, welling up slow and steaming in the dark. She put her hand in it. It was warm. The deep rock keeps one mind all year. So she made her plan around the warm back of the cave, not the cold mouth of it. Through the back of October she hauled, flat stones up from the creek, a few at a time, until her palms cracked and bled, and she bound them in rag and hauled more. She built a low wall across the middle of the room. Dry laid stone she chinked with creek clay and packed moss, separating the warm, dry deep from the wet, cold front, until the air would not pass it. She made the deep room small on purpose. A small room holds its warmth. A large room is just weather with a roof. Pull, pack, chink the gaps, until the inner room was a tight stone pocket the size of a wagon bed, with the warm spring inside it. She built a sleeping ledge above the floor, because cold pools low and warmth rises, and packed it deep with spruce boughs under her 2 quilts. She dragged in cord upon cord of dry standing dead pine on a crude travois, Bram in the traces beside her. She did, in 6 weeks, the work of 3 people. But the heart of the work, the thing Isa Dunmore swore was impossible, was the fire. And here is where Maren nearly died before winter ever came. Here is the failure. The first true fire she built deep, back near the warm spring. She banked it and lit it and lay down by it that first cold night, grateful. Bram at her back. And in the dark the smoke did exactly what Isa warned. It had nowhere to go. It rose to the low stone ceiling and spread and sank, and filled the deep room slow and silent, and Maren slid down into a sleep that was not sleep. It was Bram who saved her. The dog would not have it. He shoved his head under her arm and dragged at her and barked into her face, again and again, until she came up out of the poison gagging and crawled, blind, on hands and knees toward the cold and the light, out past the curtain of water into the freezing night, where she lay in the snow and breathed and shook and lived. A dog will not lie about death. Bram had smelled it coming through the stone. A prouder person might have called it a sign and gone down the canyon beaten. Maren did not. She lay in the snow and she thought, cold and clear, the way her father read a bad shot in the rock. She had built the fire wrong. A fire needs a road for its smoke, an upward road, and she had given it a ceiling instead. So in the morning she went looking for the road. She climbed up over the falls and along the cliff with a candle and her father's old hand drill and a steel bar, and she searched the rock above the cave for what the mountain might already have made. And she found it. A natural fissure, running up through the cliff from near the back of her room toward a vent high on the face, choked with ice and roots and rubble. A chimney! The mountain's own chimney, waiting. She cleared it, 3 days, lying on her belly in the cold, reaching, chipping, drilling out the ice, until at last she felt the draft, a cold breath pulling upward through the rock. And she moved her hearth. Not deep where she slept, but at the foot of that fissure, so the fire's smoke caught the upward draw and rode the chimney out the high vent and away. She lit a small test fire and watched the smoke gather and bend and climb and vanish into the stone, and not one breath of it stayed, and the candle she set on the sleeping ledge, in the still deep air, stood straight up. Still air. That was the proof. The fire drew its smoke out, and the deep room kept its warmth in. She had bent without breaking. Failed once, diagnosed it, built it back stronger. The warm rock. The still air. The small fire with its hidden road. The spring that never froze. By the first week of November, Maren Crane had made a living place out of a crack in a cliff, and she did not care whether the valley believed it. By August they had laughed. By October they had named her. By the first week of December, the valley mostly forgot her. The way you forget a thing you expect to be dead. And the mountain began to make its judgment. Bram knew it first. He always knew first. In the second week of December, the dog stopped sleeping in his usual spot at the mouth of the inner room and moved back, deeper, against the warm stone by the spring, and he would not be coaxed forward. Maren watched him do it and felt the cold finger of it down her spine, because she had learned to read that dog the way her father read rock. A dog does not lie about warmth. If Bram had gone deep, the cold was coming deep. Then the geese left, all at once, in a single grey afternoon, the whole sky strung with them going south, going hard, no calling, no circling, just gone. And the elk came down off the high benches into the timber far too early, drifting past the canyon mouth in long silent files. And then, on the 8th of January, the air went dead still. The wind, which never truly stops in those mountains, stopped. The trees did not move. The smoke from Maren's vent went straight up into a sky the colour of an old bruise and hung there. The whole valley seemed to be holding one long breath. Maren looked north at the wall of slate-dark sky building over the peaks, and she went back inside and banked her fire and filled every vessel she had from the warm spring, and brought Bram in close and waited. Down in the valley, Isa Dunmore looked at that same sky and started splitting wood like a man possessed. It came down out of Canada on the morning of the 9th, and it came as a verdict. It was not weather. It was a country erased. The wind came first, a solid wall of it screaming down off the divide, flinging grown men off their feet. Behind the wind came the cold, the real cold, that does not feel like temperature, but like a living hatred. Behind the cold came the snow, driven flat and sideways so thick a person could not see their own outstretched hand. The thermometer on the wall of the Hockett store fell to 30 below by noon and 40 below by dark. And then it cracked. 44 below. With the wind on top of it, for 3 days and 3 nights, without 1 minute's mercy. The storm did not hate anyone. That was the terrible thing about it. And the just thing. It did not single out the proud or spare the humble. It asked the whole valley one question, and it asked it the same way of every wall and every roof and every living soul. Can the cold get in? That was all. Nature had come down off the mountain, and nature never argued its verdicts. It simply delivered them. And the cabins began to fail. They failed the way Maren's father always said the open works fail. The cold hunted them. It found the cracks around the doors and the gaps in the chinking and the cold bridges in the corners. And it poured in, and the people inside fed their stoves and fed them, and still the heat went out faster than the fire could make it. Out in the open, the cold was the strongest thing in the world, and one by one it got in. Up the canyon, behind the falls, the cold could not find Maren Crane at all. She was down inside the warm breathing rock, where the cold had never learned to look. The falls froze, just as Asa warned, but they did not crush her, and they did not seal her tomb. They built out from the cliff in a vast curtain of blue-white ice, a foot thick and then 2. And that ice did what the snow does for the rabbit. It sealed the mouth of her cave against the wind, and behind that curtain, in the still trapped air, the warm rock gave up its steady, ancient, even heat. The little fire drew its smoke up the secret chimney, and the spring that never froze went on welling warm out of the floor. Maren Crane lay on her boughs with her dog, and was not cold. But the storm was not finished asking its question. On the second night, it asked the hard one. Because the chimney iced over, it came on slow, and the dog felt it before she did. The fissure that drew her smoke ran up through the cold cliff to the high vent, and in that killing cold the moisture in the smoke began to freeze on its walls, ring by ring, narrowing the road. Until late on the second night the draw began to fail. The fire smoked. The still air she had worked so hard to make began to turn against her. And Bram was up on his feet, with his hackles high, pacing, shoving at her, barking that deep, rough bark into the dark. A dog does not lie about death. Maren came up off the ledge, already knowing. She did not panic, because panic is just pride in a hurry, and she had no use for either. The ice was in the chimney, high up, near the vent. To reach it she would have to go out past the ice curtain, into the heart of the Black Northern, up the frozen face of the cliff above the falls, in the dark, in 44 below, and a wind that could throw a horse, with one bad handhold between her and a 40-foot fall onto the ice of the pool below. She took her father's hand drill and his steel bar. She wrapped her ruined hands. She put her face against Bram's rough head one moment, the way you say a thing you cannot say in words, and told him to stay, and for once he obeyed. And then she broke out through the gap, at the edge of the ice curtain, into the full fury of the storm. The cold hit her like a wall of stone. It stopped her breath in her chest. The wind clawed at her, and the snow blinded her, and the world narrowed down to the rock under her bleeding hands, and the next hold, and the next. She climbed the face she had learned in the autumn, every crack of it, by feel, because there was nothing to see but white roaring dark. Pull, hold, find the next. The drop yawning below her, up along the line of the buried chimney, until she reached the vent and her fingers found the plug of ice choking the road. And she drilled it, lying flat on the frozen cliff in the screaming dark. One arm hooked through a crack to keep the wind from taking her. She worked her father's bar into that ice, and broke it, and broke it, and broke it, while her hands went past pain into a deep wooden silence that frightened her more than pain would have. And then, all at once, she felt it. A warm draught sighing up out of the cleared vent against her frozen face, smelling of wood smoke and the deep earth. The road open again. The chimney drawing. How she got down she never fully remembered. She came back through the ice curtain more dead than alive and fell onto the warm stone floor, and Bram was on her at once, licking the ice from her face, lying his whole weight along her to give her his heat. And the fire, drawing clean again, built its small steady warmth back into the room. It gave her back her life. By morning 2 fingertips were lost to her, gone wooden forever, and she did not care, because she was alive, and the room was warm, and the candle on the ledge stood straight up again in the still and breathing air. On the 3rd day the wind broke. On the 4th, the sun came up on a country that did not look like the world, and the valley began, slowly, to count what the stone winter had taken. The cattle were gone. Whole herds drifted and frozen against the fences in long grey windrows. And it had taken people. In more than one cabin everybody had believed was strong, and there were empty chairs at a good many tables when the spring finally came. And when men could finally move, Isa Dunmore put on every stitch he owned and broke a trail up Toller Creek. Not because he expected to find anyone alive. Because he was a decent man, and he could not bear to leave the widow's bones up there unburied through the spring. He went to dig a grave. He found her splitting wood. He found smoke rising clean from a vent in the cliff, an ice curtain glowing blue with firelight behind it, and Maren Crane in the dooryard of her impossible home, alive, lean, her bandaged hands working slow, and a big brindle dog asleep in a patch of sun on the warm stone, deep and easy. A dog does not lie about warmth. Asa Dunmore looked at that sleeping dog, and at the steam off the spring, and at the woman he had been certain was dead, and the smartest man in the valley took off his hat. She brought him in past the curtain of ice. She did not say a word of triumph. And Asa Dunmore stood in the warm still air of that deep stone room and put his bare hand flat against the back wall, the warm living rock, and held it there a long time. He had brought a thermometer. Of course he had. He hung it on the stone, and they waited, and the red thread climbed and settled, and stood there, steady, the way the still air stood, 49 degrees. And then, As the small fire did its small work, it crept higher still and held at 52. Outside, the morning glass read 30 below. Two numbers, 82 degrees of difference between the world the valley lived in and the world behind the water. And the numbers required no interpretation. They were just true. Isa thought of his own house, the best-built house in the valley, where he had burned wood for 3 days without ceasing, and still woken to frost on the inside of his walls. And he thought of the small, neat stack along Maren's cold room, how little of it was gone. "You burned what?" he asked her quietly. "Through the whole storm. An armful a day," she said. "Maybe less. The rock does the most of it." Isa Dunmore stood there a long while. He was a proud man, in the good sense of the word, a man who had earned his standing honestly, and it cost him something to say what he said next. He did not make a speech. Frontier men do not make speeches. He just looked at the warm stone, and the steady glass, and the woman who had known what he did not, and he said 3 words. "I was wrong." And Maren Crane, who had been called a fool and a witch and a debt, did not gloat. She only nodded, once, and put a little more wood on her small fire, and let the warm rock go on saying everything that needed to be said. That should have been the end of it. But there was still the knock on the door. It came not many nights later, when a second storm, smaller than the first but cruel enough, came down off the divide, and the valley, already gutted, had nothing left to meet it with. The Sutter place lost its roof to the wind in the dark. Silas Sutter, the man who had set a widow's bundle on his step and called it good sense, found himself in the small hours with his roof gone, and his wife and his children crowded into one failing room, the cold pouring in, and nowhere to run, except up a dead-end canyon to a crack behind a frozen waterfall where smoke rose clean and warm into the storm. He did not want to go. The pride in him, the second villain, fought it to the last. But the cold is an honest teacher, and his children were crying, and so Silas Sutter took his family by night up the very canyon he had once been certain led only to a fool's grave. And he stood at the mouth of the cave witch's cave in the snow, and he begged. It was little Tess who came forward first. 7 years old, half frozen, and she pushed past her father's legs and ran straight into the warm dark and threw her arms around the woman she had cried for at the gate. And Maren Crane knelt on the warm stone and held that child against the cold. And over the small dark head she looked up at Silas Sutter standing wretched in the doorway, the man who had thrown her away. She could have said 100 things. She had earned every one of them. She said none of them. She stood, with the child in her arms, and stepped back and opened her hand toward the warm, deep room and the fire. "Come in," she said. "There is room." And that was all. No speech, no reckoning, no satisfaction taken. She let them in out of the cold, the whole shivering lot of them, and gave them the warmth of the rock without one word of what it had cost her to find it. The gloating, if there was to be any in this story, she left to the valley, and to the years, and to you. They all lived. Every soul who crowded into that warm stone room behind the falls came through the stone winter alive, while stronger houses than theirs stood empty in the valley below. When the spring came, there was one story that did not fade with the snow. By the next autumn, 2 other families had found cracks in cliffs of their own. Asa Dunmore himself spent that whole next summer studying the deep rock and dug warm cellars deep into the south banks for half the valley, all of it learned from a crack behind a waterfall. The knowledge spread the way good knowledge does, quiet and sure, outliving the men who had once been so certain it was foolishness. And the name changed. The valley had called it the Cave Witch's Hole when they meant it as a curse. But the children who grew up warm because of her did not say it that way. They gave her back her own name, the name the Sutters had tried to take, and the place behind the falls became, for that whole country, and for years after, the Crane Hollow. Not the Witch's Cave. The Crane Hollow. The idea outlived the argument, the way it always does. She lived up there a long time, Maren Crane, and in time she was not an outcast at all, but the keeper of the canyon, the one the valley sent its young people to learn from. And she never once, by any account, said "I told you so." She did not need to. The rock said it for her, every winter, 52 degrees, and steady, while the wind screamed itself out against the cliff and found, year after year, that it could not get in. Because that was the whole of what her father taught her, and the whole of what the valley finally learned. The cold hunts the open. The strongest shelter was never the one that looked like strength. It was the one humble enough to go still, and low, and deep, and let the patient old mountain do its work. The deep rock keeps one mind all year. You only have to be humble enough to crawl in out of the open and accept it. So here is the question I want to leave with you tonight, and I truly want your answer down below. When you saw that woman walking up the canyon with her one dog and her one bundle, toward the falls, toward the dark, while a whole valley laughed and called her the cave witch, which one would you have been? Would you have stood in the store with Della Hockett and laughed along, certain she was a fool walking off to die? Or would you have been one of the rare few, like the old builder, Isa Dunmore, humble enough to wonder if the laughed-at woman might know something you didn't, and brave enough to follow her up that frozen canyon to see for yourself what the mountain had been keeping warm all along? Tell me down in the comments. I read them all. And then come back, and stay warm, and remember, the cold always hunts the open. The trick has always been knowing where the rock is still breathing.